Carrying legally may now be treated as a crime. That's the contradiction exposed by the death of Alex Pretti. The state says it supports lawful gun ownership, but when Pretti was killed, officials didn't point to an attack or a violent act. They pointed to his preparedness. An extra magazine, they said, suggested nefarious intent. That phrase became central to how the shooting was justified. Inference. Preparation itself was reframed as threat. This matters to you, even if you never planned to confront anyone, because it means legality no longer guarantees protection. The moment law enforcement enters the scene, the assumptions flip. What you thought was responsible can instantly be reinterpreted as dangerous. And once that frame is accepted, the outcome becomes easier to explain away. But here's the part nobody wants to linger on. This explanation didn't emerge slowly. It appeared fully formed, defended immediately, and repeated with confidence, almost as if it was waiting. So the real hook in this story isn't just what happened to Alex Pretti, it's why the narrative was ready the moment he was gone. What followed was presented as damage control, but it moved more like coordination. The focus didn't stay on uncertainty or unanswered questions. It narrowed fast. On television, in statements, in carefully chosen language. Senior officials moved quickly to emphasize Pretti's equipment and frame it as evidence of dangerous intent. Inference. The goal wasn't to wait for clarity, but to set the terms of interpretation early. This is where the story stops being about a single shooting and starts looking like a pattern. The message wasn't subtle. What mattered wasn't whether Pretti broke the law, but how his preparedness could be described after the fact. The narrative did not ask what went wrong. It suggested what was inevitable. Notice what they didn't lead with. There was no emphasis on restraint, no acknowledgement of ambiguity, no suggestion that lawful behavior deserved the benefit of the doubt. Instead, the framing implied a lesson. Certain legal actions become unacceptable the moment authority feels challenged. This is where the issue reframes itself. If the state can redefine intent after someone is dead, then legality becomes conditional, not protective. So here's the question that changes the stakes. If the rules are being rewritten in hindsight, how is anyone supposed to follow them in real time? Here's where the logic turns explicit. The justification wasn't implied, it was stated. Officials argued that approaching law enforcement while armed creates a high likelihood that officers are legally justified in using lethal force. Those words matter. They don't describe a mistake, they describe an expectation. Inference. The presence of a firearm near authority is treated as escalation by default. This reframes everything. The issue is no longer about misconduct or threat, it's about proximity. If you are armed and close enough, the outcome is considered foreseeable. That framing quietly erases intent. It doesn't matter why you're there, it doesn't matter what you plan to do, the risk is assumed before any action occurs. Notice what's missing from this logic. There's no space for lawful carry as a stabilizing factor. No acknowledgement that legality might reduce suspicion. Instead, legality becomes irrelevant once an encounter begins. This is where the story flips. The right isn't revoked in writing, it's neutralized in practice. You're allowed to carry, but the moment that right intersects with enforcement, it becomes a justification for force. And once that idea is accepted, it doesn't stay confined to one case. It becomes a rule people learn the hard way. Once that expectation is normalized, escalation stops looking accidental. It starts looking procedural. The Pretti case wasn't framed as a tragic exception. It was explained as the predictable result of an armed encounter. The justification focused on how likely lethal force was under those conditions. Inference. The system is being trained to see these outcomes as routine rather than alarming. There's a historical echo here, and it's uncomfortable. Time and again, extraordinary powers are introduced as temporary responses, then quietly absorbed into standard practice. What begins as reasonable under the circumstances becomes how these situations usually end. The bar doesn't move loudly, it slides. This is where normalization does its real work. When an outcome is treated as expected, scrutiny fades. Investigation becomes confirmation, not questioning. The explanation arrives arrives faster than the doubt. Here's why that matters. Once this logic is embedded, it doesn't require malicious intent to repeat. It only requires consistency. Officers act within expectations. Prosecutors defend within precedent. Leaders stand by the system they've already endorsed. This is where the story stops being about one shooting and starts becoming infrastructure. And once something becomes infrastructure, undoing it is far harder than introducing it. Do you want me to continue to the next part? Okay. Here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. While officials publicly affirmed support for lawful gun ownership, they simultaneously leaned on a narrative that made Pretti's lawful gear the centerpiece of suspicion. His equipment was highlighted to justify the shooting, even as the administration maintained pro-Second Amendment language. Inference. Rights were being defended rhetorically while undermined operationally. This gap between words and actions is the most destabilizing element of the entire story. On paper, nothing changed. In practice, everything did. The same conduct that was celebrated in campaign rhetoric was recast as dangerous when it collided with federal authority. That reversal doesn't happen by accident. It happens when institutions protect themselves first. Here's the detail that permanently alters how you read this case. The justification didn't depend on chaos, fear, or split-second confusion. It depended on foresight. The argument was that this outcome was foreseeable, even likely given the circumstances. That turns the explanation into a warning. Once a warning is established, it reshapes behavior. Not for the state, but for everyone else. You're being shown which rights are safe to exercise in theory and which ones carry unacceptable risk in reality. And that realization forces the next question. If predictability is being used to justify force, who is expected to adapt, the system or the citizen? Okay, from there the situation compresses into a mini-crisis. Multiple pressures land at once, the narrative is locked in early, the justification is repeated, and no meaningful correction arrives from the top. There was no visible effort to soften or reverse the framing once it took hold. Inference. The explanation wasn't a misstep, it was an acceptable outcome. At the same time, alternative interpretations are squeezed out. The possibility that Pretti was acting as a good Samaritan fades from official emphasis. The story becomes cleaner, simpler, easier to defend. Equipment equals intent. Proximity equals threat. The chain is closed. This is how loss of control actually looks. Not chaos, but speed. Not confusion, but consolidation. Before courts weigh in, before investigations finish, behavior starts adjusting on its own. Officers internalize expectations, citizens absorb risk. And notice how fast this happens. There's no cooling off period, no visible internal debate, just a rapid stacking of signals that point in one direction. So ask the only question that matters at this stage. What happens if this continues? Okay, now look at where the impact actually lands. Not in court filings or press statements, but in ordinary decisions people make every day. The message being sent is that lawful carry near law enforcement dramatically increases the risk of lethal force. Inference. People are being conditioned to treat their own rights as liabilities. That changes behavior in ways that never make headlines. You hesitate before stepping forward. You think twice before intervening. You decide it's safer to stay back, stay quiet, stay uninvolved, not because you don't care, but because the cost of being misread is fatal. This strips politics out of the equation. It doesn't matter who you voted for. It matters how you survive an encounter. When preparedness is reframed as provocation, the rational response is disengagement. And disengagement has consequences. Communities become colder, trust thins, responsibility retreats. Here's the part that doesn't get acknowledged. A system that discourages lawful people from acting doesn't just reduce risk for itself, it transfers risk outward. Someone else pays the price for that silence. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because recognition is how patterns stop being isolated and start being understood. Do you want me to continue to the next part? Okay. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to step back from the incident and look at the machinery behind it. Systems don't respond to morality. They respond to incentives. The official framing consistently centers officer safety as the overriding priority. Inference. Once that priority becomes absolute, every armed civilian is treated as a risk to be managed, not a right to be respected. This is how power shifts without announcing itself. No new law is passed, no amendment is challenged. Instead, interpretation does the work. The standard quietly moves from "is this legal" to "does this feel dangerous?" And feelings are far easier to defend after the fact than rules. Here's the unsettling insight. This doesn't require bad intentions. It runs on alignment. Agencies want reduced liability. Prosecutors want cases that hold up. Political leaders want controversies that die quickly. The safest path for the system is the one that justifies force early and discourages scrutiny later. That's why this story feels bigger than outrage. It reveals a structure where caution protects the state while uncertainty is pushed onto the citizen. And once a structure like that is in place, it doesn't need constant justification. It becomes self-sustaining. Do you want me to continue to the next part? Okay. From here, the future doesn't branch cleanly. It drifts. One path is quiet normalization. The Pretti framing holds. It isn't cited as law, but it's absorbed as expectation. Armed encounters are treated as inherently volatile. Outcomes like this are seen as unfortunate but predictable. Narratives shape behavior long before courts do. Inference. People adjust first, institutions later. The other path is erosion, not rebellion, not backlash, but withdrawal. Lawful citizens step back from public life. They avoid involvement. They stop trusting that legality offers protection when it matters most. The system still functions, but with less cooperation and more distance. Notice the uncertainty. There's no clear correction forming, no signal that this interpretation will be rolled back. What's forming instead is momentum. Each similar case will reinforce the last, slowly setting the boundaries of acceptable risk. And here's what makes this moment fragile. The next move won't come from a ruling or a press conference. It will come from behavior on the ground, from what people decide is worth the danger. That decision is already taking shape, quietly, one encounter at a time. Here's the thread that pulls the whole story tight. This isn't only about Alex Pretti or even about guns. It's about how power redefines responsibility when it feels exposed. A right that exists until it creates discomfort isn't really a right. It's a conditional allowance. Nothing in this case required a change in law to alter behavior. Inference. The shift happened through narrative, not legislation. Through what was emphasized, repeated, and defended. That's how systems evolve without ever announcing a policy shift. Seen through that lens, the Pretti case becomes a warning sign, not a conclusion. It shows how quickly legality can lose its protective force when risk is reinterpreted by authority. And that leaves an open loop, not about what already happened, but about what happens next. Because once people internalize that the rules change at the moment of enforcement, they adapt permanently. If you want to keep following how these patterns emerge before they become obvious, subscribe and stay with us. This isn't the end of the story, it's the direction it's moving.